down the lights, get comfortable, and welcome back to the vault. You're listening to Late Night True Stories. Tonight, we are opening the archives for another hour of unsolved mysteries, unexplained disappearances, and chilling true crime cases. Put your phone face down, close your eyes, and let the rain pull you into the dark. Our first story takes us to a quiet beach in South Australia. On the early morning of December 1st, 1948, a man was found lying dead on the sand of Somerton Beach. He was impeccably dressed in a suit and tie, his shoes polished to a shine. A half-smoked cigarette rested on his collar, but when police arrived, the mystery began to unravel. He carried no wallet, no identification, and chillingly, every single manufacturer's label had been meticulously cut out of his clothing. The autopsy deepened the confusion. The coroner found his spleen was enlarged and his liver congested with blood. It was a textbook case of poisoning, but there was no trace of any known poison in his system. It was as if he had been killed by a ghost. Weeks later, a breakthrough. A brown suitcase was discovered at a nearby train station, checked in the day before he died. Inside were clothes. Again, with all labels removed, along with a stenciling brush and a very specific type of thread that matched a repair on his trousers. Still, nothing to identify him. Then, a forensic expert found a tiny, secret pocket sewn deep inside the dead man's trousers. Inside was a tightly rolled scrap of paper torn from the final page of a rare book of Persian poetry. Printed on the scrap were two words, Tamam Shud. Translated, it means, it is ended. Following a massive public appeal, a man came forward with a copy of that exact book. He claimed he had found it tossed into the back seat of his unlocked car near Somerton Beach on the night the man died. In the back of the book, police found two things scrawled faintly in pencil. The first was an uncrackable, encrypted code made of random letters. The second was a local phone number. The number belonged to a nurse named Jessica Thompson, who lived just a few hundred yards from where the body was found. When police interviewed her and showed her a plaster cast of the dead man's face, she was said to be completely taken aback to the point of nearly fainting. Yet, she adamantly denied knowing him. To this day, the code has never been broken. The poison was never identified, and the true identity of the Somerton Man remains buried in the sand. In December 1900, passing ships noticed something deeply unsettling off the coast of Scotland. The massive lighthouse on the remote Flannan Isles had gone completely dark. Days later, a relief ship called the Hesperus arrived at the island to investigate. As they approached, the crew fired a flare and blew the ship's horn. There was no answer. No flag was flying on the flagpole. The three lighthouse keepers who lived on the barren rock had vanished. The relief keeper, a man named Joseph Maura, climbed the steep, jagged stairs to the lighthouse. When he pushed open the heavy entrance door, the silence inside was deafening.
kitchen door was closed inside. The fire in the grate had been dead for days. The beds were unmade. The mechanical clocks had completely stopped, and strangely, a single wooden chair was toppled over on the floor, as if someone had jumped up in a panic. When Maura checked the coat hooks, he found one set of heavy oilskin rain gear still hanging there. This meant one of the men had gone out into the freezing winter storm in nothing but his indoor clothes. A strict violation of Lighthouse rules. But the most chilling evidence was left behind in the official logbook. On December 12th, Keeper Thomas Marshall wrote of severe, terrifying winds, the likes of which he had never seen in 20 years at sea. He noted that the principal keeper was unusually quiet, and the third man, William MacArthur, a notoriously tough and hardened sailor, was weeping. Why were three seasoned, hardened men crying and praying over a storm? The mystery only deepens when you look at the mainland weather records. According to meteorological stations in Scotland, there were no storms in the area. On December 12th, 13th, or 14th, the skies were clear. The seas were calm. Whatever the men were experiencing out on that rock, it wasn't a normal storm. The final logbook entry, dated December 15th, read simply, "Storm ended. Sea calm. God is over all." The men were never seen again. Deep in the woods of southwestern Vermont lies a stretch of wilderness, so steeped in strange vanishings. Locals simply refer to it as the Bennington Triangle. Between 1945 and 1950, 5 people walked into this specific patch of the Green Mountains. None of them ever walked out. The most famous was Paula Jean Weldon on December 1st, 1946. The 18-year-old college student decided to take a hike along the long trail. She was wearing a bright red coat, impossible to miss against the snowy, white landscape. Several other hikers saw her on the trail that afternoon. An elderly couple walked just 100 yards behind her. They watched her bright red coat turn a corner around a bend in the path. But when the couple turned that exact same corner seconds later, the trail was completely empty. Paula had vanished into thin air. There were no footprints leading off the trail into the snow. There were no signs of a struggle. A massive search party of over 1,000 people scoured the woods backed by aircraft and the FBI. They never found a single shred of her bright red coat. She wasn't the first, and she wouldn't be the last. A year earlier, a 74-year-old mountain guide named Mitty Rivers, a man who knew the trails better than anyone, walked ahead of his hunting party and disappeared without a trace. 3 years after Paula, an 8-year-old boy named Paul Jepson vanished from his mother's truck while she fed the pigs. Bloodhounds tracked his scent right up to the exact same mountain trail, and then lost it, as if he had been snatched directly into the sky. 5 people, 5 impossible disappearances. And to this day, the Bennington Triangle keeps its secrets buried beneath the pine needles. There is a specific kind of terror in a crime that leaves absolutely no trace behind. It was June 6, 1992, in the quiet, suburban town of Springfield, Missouri 19-year-old Susie Streeter and her friend Stacy McCall had just graduated high school. After a night of celebrating, they decided to sleep over at the home of Susie's mother, Cheryl Levitt. They arrived at the house around 2:15 in the morning. They washed their makeup off. They got into bed. The next morning, friends came by to check on the girls. When they arrived, the front door was unlocked. Inside, the house was perfectly still. Cheryl's Yorkshire Terrier was running around nervously, but otherwise nothing was out of place. The television was playing softly in the living room. All three women's purses were lined up neatly on the floor. Their car keys were on the counter. Their cars were still parked in the driveway. It looked as though they had just stepped into the other room, but the house was completely empty. There was no blood, no signs of a struggle, nothing stolen. The only clue that something terrible had happened was found right outside the front door. The glass globe of the front porch light had been shattered. But the broken glass wasn't scattered randomly. It had been meticulously swept up and pushed neatly onto the welcome mat. How do three grown women vanish from a small suburban home in the middle of the night without making a single sound? Over 3 decades later, the police still don't have a single suspect. On a freezing February night in 2004, a dark winding road in New Hampshire swallowed a 21-year-old nursing student whole. Without telling her friends or family, Maura Murray packed her car, emptied her bank account, and drove hours away from her college campus into the desolate White Mountains around 7:30 p.m. She lost control on a sharp, unlit curve, crashing her car into a snowbank. A local man driving a school bus passed by and offered help. Maura, shivering in the cold, pleaded with him not to call the police. She told him she had already called roadside assistance, but there was no cell service in those woods. She was lying. The bus driver drove to his house just down the road and called the sheriff. The police arrived exactly 7 minutes later. But when the officer shined his flashlight into the windshield, Maura was gone. The car was locked. A box of wine was spilled across the back seat. But there were no footprints in the fresh, deep snow leading into the woods. The dark, heavily forested highway was completely empty. In a window of just 7 minutes in the dead of winter, Maura Murray vanished into the dark. Did she run into the freezing forest to hide? Or did she get into a passing car with exactly the wrong person? 2 decades later, the freezing mountains have never given up her secret.
There are places in the world that feel completely untethered from reality. The Sands Boys Mountains in southeastern Oklahoma are exactly that kind of place. Dense, isolated, and completely unforgiving. In October of 2009, 44-year-old Bobby Jamison, his 40-year-old wife Sherilyn, and their 6-year-old daughter Madison drove up into these mountains. They were looking for a 40-acre plot of land to buy. They wanted to build a storage shed, move completely off the grid, and disappear into the wilderness. And that is exactly what happened. but not in the way they planned. 8 days after they were last seen, hunters stumbled across the Jamison family's white pickup truck, parked on a remote dirt road deep in the mountains. The truck was locked when police arrived and forced the door open. They found the family's emaciated dog, Macy, barely clinging to life in the back seat. She had survived by eating her own feces. But the family was entirely gone. As investigators searched the vehicle, the scene only grew more baffling. The Jamisons hadn't been robbed. Under the driver's seat, police found a bank bag containing $32,000 in hard cash. Sherilyn's purse was sitting on the floorboard. Bobby's wallet and ID were right there. Their cell phones, the truck keys, and their GPS unit were all locked securely inside the cab. People do not walk into a freezing, rugged mountain range without their coats, their money, their phones, or their child's dog. A massive search and rescue operation was launched. Hundreds of volunteers, drones, and tracking dogs scoured the mountainside. The dogs caught no scent. The drones saw nothing. The Jamisons had vanished like smoke. When investigators returned to the Jamison home to look for clues, they pulled the security camera footage from the day the family left. What they saw sent chills down the spine of everyone in the room. The footage showed Bobby and Sherilyn backing the truck in the driveway, but they were moving in a bizarre, trance-like state for over 15 minutes. They made dozens of trips back and forth from the house to the truck. They moved silently, never looking at each other, never speaking a word, their movements incredibly stiff and mechanical. At one point, they stopped and stared blankly out at the street for long, unnatural moments. Then, police checked the cell phone recovered from the locked truck on it. They found a single terrifying photograph. It was a picture of 6-year-old Madison, taken up on the mountain, but she wasn't smiling. Her arms were crossed tightly over her chest. Her face was pale, her expression twisted into a look of absolute frozen terror, staring at whoever was holding the camera. Was Bobby taking the picture? Was Sherilyn? Or was there someone else on that mountain with them? 4 years later, in November 2013, 2 deer hunters were walking through a densely wooded area, just 3 miles from where the truck had been abandoned there. Lying side by side, face down in the dirt, were the skeletal remains of Bobby, Sherilyn, and Madison. Because of the severe decomposition, the medical examiner could never determine the cause of death. There were no broken bones, no obvious trauma. The security tape, the cash left behind, the terrifying final photograph to this day. No one knows what followed the Jamison family up into the Sands Boys Mountains, or what made sure they never came back down. Hotels are designed to be temporary. But sometimes, a single room absorbs a secret so strange, it echoes for a century. On January 2nd, 1935, a young man walked into the hotel president in Kansas City. He signed the register as Roland T. Owen. He carried absolutely no luggage. Only a comb, a hairbrush, and toothpaste. He was given the key to room 146. The next morning, the hotel maid entered to clean the room was cast in pitch darkness. Every heavy window shade was pulled tightly down. Owen sat perfectly still in a chair in the dark. He told her to leave the door unlocked because he was expecting a friend. Then he quietly left the room. When she returned hours later, the room was still black. Owen was lying fully dressed on the unmade bed. On the desk, she noticed a handwritten note that read, "Don, I will be back in 15 minutes, wait." The next day, the maid returned. The door was locked from the outside, so she used her master key. Owen was inside, sitting in the dark again. He was on the phone, saying, "No, Don, I don't want to eat. I just had breakfast." That afternoon, she brought fresh towels. She knocked. A deep, gruff voice, a voice that did not belong to Owen, answered through the heavy wood. "Who is it?" the strange voice asked. "Fresh towels," she replied. "We don't need any." The voice snapped. The door never opened. The following morning, the hotel operator noticed room 146's phone was off the hook. A bellboy went up. The door was locked with a "Do Not Disturb" sign hanging from the knob. "Hang up your phone!" he shouted through the door. A weak, groaning voice replied, "Come in, turn on the lights." The door wouldn't budge. He assumed the man was drunk and left. But an hour later, the phone was still off the hook. Finally, a bellboy returned with a master key, pushed the door open, and stepped into a scene of absolute, unimaginable horror. Owen was crouched in the corner. The room was completely covered in blood. He had been brutally beaten and stabbed multiple times. His wrists and ankles were bound with cord. Yet, he was still alive. When police arrived, they found all of his clothes were gone. The hotel's towels and soap were missing. The murder weapon vanished. Someone had completely sterilized the room of evidence, locked the door from the outside, and disappeared. A detective knelt beside the dying man. "Who did this to you?" Owen whispered, "Nobody." He died in the hospital hours later. The mystery only deepened. His real name wasn't Roland T. Owen. It was Artemis Ogletree. And weeks later, an anonymous person paid for his funeral with cash sent through the mail, including a bouquet of roses with a card reading, "Love forever, Lucille." The gruff voice, the mysterious Don, the brutal sterilization of the crime scene. To this day, the slaughtering room on 46 remains completely unsolved. Just outside the city of Bergen, Norway, lies a dark, unforgiving stretch of rocky terrain known as Isdal. The locals have a different name for it: Death Valley. On the freezing afternoon of November 29th, 1970, a university professor and his 2 young daughters were hiking through the craggy rocks when they smelled something terrible blowing in the wind. It was the distinct, sickening scent of burning meat. They followed the smoke to a secluded scree slope hidden from the main trail. There, lying on her back among the blackened rocks, was the severely burned body of a woman. The scene was meticulously, bizarrely staged. Her arms were positioned in a boxer's pose, typical of burn victims. But placed neatly around her charred body were several strange items. A half-empty bottle of local liquor, 2 plastic water bottles, a silver spoon, and a burned passport. But it was what was missing that truly disturbed the investigators. Every single identifying mark on the scene had been completely destroyed. The labels on the water bottles were rubbed off. The labels on her clothing had been painstakingly cut out with scissors. Even her fingerprints appeared to have been sanded down. Days later, police made a massive breakthrough. They located 2 suitcases locked inside a storage box at the nearby Bergen train station. The fingerprints on the luggage matched the dead woman. When detectives opened the suitcases, they found a trove of strange, high-end items. Designer clothing, a stash of foreign currency, several pairs of non-prescription glasses with the lenses popped out, and various high-quality wigs. It was the textbook toolkit of a spy. But the most important piece of evidence was hidden in the lining of a bag. A small black notebook filled with rows of cryptic encrypted codes. Military intelligence was brought in to crack the cipher. When they finally broke it, the notebook revealed a dizzying schedule of European travel dates, train routes, and fake names. Investigators discovered the Isdal Woman had traveled across Europe, using at least 9 different fake identities, constantly switching hotels and requesting to change rooms multiple times a day to avoid being watched. The autopsy only deepened the impossible puzzle. The medical examiner found soot in her lungs, meaning she was alive when she was set on fire. But they also found over 50 unabsorbed sleeping pills in her stomach. Furthermore, she had a massive bruise on the side of her neck, indicating a brutal struggle. Was it an elaborate, agonizing suicide? Or was she a Cold War spy who had finally been hunted down by her enemies, dragged out into Death Valley, and silenced forever? Despite international investigations, Interpol alerts, and modern DNA analysis, her true name has never been discovered. She remains a ghost, burned into the rocks of the Ice Valley. The air is a profound, terrifying isolation that comes with flying a small plane alone at night over open water. You are completely disconnected from the earth, surrounded by absolute blackness. On the evening of October 21st, 1978, 20-year-old pilot Frederick Valentich was experiencing this exact isolation. He was flying a rented Cessna 182 over the Bass Strait, a notoriously treacherous stretch of water between mainland Australia and Tasmania. The weather was clear. The ocean below was completely dark. At 7:06 p.m., Valentich keyed his microphone and radioed Melbourne flight service.
Melbourne, this is Delta Sierra Juliet.
Valentich said calmly, "Is there any known traffic below 5,000 feet?" Air traffic control checked their radar. They replied, "No known traffic." "I am. Seems to be a large aircraft below 5,000. Valentich responded. His voice was steady, but there was a faint edge of confusion. He described a massive craft illuminated by 4 bright landing lights. He said it had just passed 1,000 feet directly over his head, moving at an impossible speed. Melbourne Control asked him to identify the aircraft type. "I cannot confirm," Valentich said. "It has a long shape. It's moving too fast." For the next 5 minutes, an incredibly eerie and tense exchange played out over the radio. Valentich reported that the strange craft was now actively orbiting him. It was playing a game. "It seems to be stationary," Valentich radioed. "I'm orbiting, and the thing is just orbiting on top of me. It's got a green light and sort of metallic, like it's all shiny on the outside." Down in Melbourne, the air traffic controller stared at a completely empty radar screen. Whatever Valentich was looking at, it wasn't showing up on their instruments. Then,
the situation turned dire.
Melbourne.
Valentich said, panic finally bleeding into his voice. My engine is rough idling. I've got it set at 24, and the thing is, it's coughing. The controller asked what his intentions were. My intentions are to proceed to King Island, Valentich replied. There was a brief pause of dead air. Then Valentich keyed his microphone for the final time. That strange aircraft is hovering on top of me again, he said. His voice was breathless, terrified. It is hovering, and it's not an aircraft. For 17 agonizing seconds, the radio transmitted nothing but a strange metallic scraping noise. It sounded like metal grinding against metal. And then the transmission went completely dead. A massive sea and air search was launched instantly. Ships scoured the base, straight aircraft swept the dark waters. But they never found a single piece of wreckage. No oil slick, no life jacket, no plane. To this day, the 17 seconds of metallic scraping at the end of the tape have never been identified, and Frederick Valentich never returned from the dark.
On the afternoon of November 24th, 1971, a man in a dark business suit walked into the Portland International Airport. He carried a black attaché case. He paid cash for a one-way ticket to Seattle under the name Dan Cooper. He boarded Northwest Orient Airlines Flight 305, walked to the back of the plane, and took seat 18C. Before takeoff, he ordered a bourbon and water. He lit a cigarette. He was completely calm, polite, and unremarkable. A man who looked like 1,000 other businessmen traveling for the holidays. But shortly after the plane lifted off into the stormy Pacific Northwest sky, he flagged down a young flight attendant. He handed her a folded piece of paper, assuming he was just slipping her his phone number. She dropped it unopened into her purse. Cooper leaned closer. "Miss," he whispered over the drone of the engines. "You'd better look at that note. I have a bomb." The flight attendant opened the note. It demanded $200,000 in $20 bills and 4 parachutes. To prove he was serious, Cooper opened his briefcase just enough for her to see 8 red cylinders wrapped in thick wire and a large cylindrical battery. The pilot was quietly informed. The airline executives on the ground agreed to pay the ransom. For the next 2 hours, the plane circled Seattle in a heavy rainstorm while authorities scrambled to gather the cash and the parachutes. Throughout the entire ordeal, Cooper remained impossibly calm. He even offered to pay for his bourbon. When the plane finally landed in Seattle, the money and parachutes were brought on board. True to his word, Cooper let all 36 passengers and several crew members off the plane. But he wasn't done. He ordered the pilot to take off again, this time heading south toward Mexico. He gave the flight crew incredibly specific instructions. The plane must remain below 10,000 feet. The wing flaps must be lowered to 15 degrees. The cabin must remain unpressurized, and the landing gear must stay deployed. He knew exactly what the Boeing 727 was capable of. Once they were back in the air, flying through a freezing, pitch-black thunderstorm, Cooper ordered the remaining crew into the cockpit and told them to lock the door. They were completely alone at the front of the plane. Cooper was alone in the back.
At 8 p.m., a warning light flashed in the cockpit. The aft air stair, the heavy door at the very tail of the plane, had just been lowered. The pilots felt a sudden, massive shift in air pressure. The nose of the plane pitched violently upward as a massive weight detached from the tail. When the plane finally landed safely hours later, the FBI stormed the cabin. They found the empty bourbon glass. They found 2 of the parachutes, and they found Cooper's clip-on tie resting on a seat. But the man in the dark suit was gone. He had stepped off the back stairs of a jet traveling at 200 miles per hour, plunging into a freezing thunderstorm over the dense, mountainous wilderness of Washington state. Despite a massive manhunt, thousands of FBI interviews, and decades of searching, Dan Cooper simply vanished into the night sky. He remains the perpetrator of the only unsolved skyjacking in commercial aviation history.
Stand. In June 2014, Derek and Maria Broaddus bought their dream home. It was a massive, beautiful $1 million estate at 657 Boulevard in the affluent suburb of Westfield, New Jersey. It was meant to be the perfect place to raise their 3 young children. 3 days after closing on the house, before they had even moved in, Derek went to check the mail. Inside the box was a thick white envelope addressed simply to the new owner. He opened it, expecting a welcome note from a neighbor. Instead, he read a letter that would shatter their lives. The letter began, "Dearest new neighbor at 657 Boulevard. Allow me to welcome you to the neighborhood. 657 Boulevard has been the subject of my family for decades now. And as it approaches its 110th birthday, I have been put in charge of watching and waiting for its second coming." The writer went on to claim that his grandfather watched the house in the 1920s and his father watched it in the 1960s. Now, it was his turn. But it was the terrifying specific details in the letter that made Derek's blood run cold. "I see already that you have flooded 657 Boulevard with contractors." The letter continued, "Bad move. You don't want to make 657 Boulevard unhappy. You have children, I have seen them. So far, I think there are 3 that I have counted. Do you need to fill the house with the young blood I requested? Better for me." The letter was signed simply, "The Watcher." Derek instantly called the police. They advised the family not to move into the house. 2 weeks later, a second letter arrived. This one was even more unhinged. The Watcher knew the children's names. He knew which bedrooms they had chosen. "Will the young blood play in the basement?" the letter asked. "Or are they too afraid to go down there alone? I would be very afraid if I were them. It is far away from the rest of the house. If you were upstairs, you would never hear them scream." The Broaddus family stopped the renovations. They stopped visiting the house. They installed hidden cameras and hired private investigators. The local police launched a massive investigation, running DNA tests on the stamps and interrogating the neighbors. But every lead hit a dead end. The Watcher knew intimate details that could only be seen from specific angles. Perhaps from a neighbor's window or directly from the yard. He mocked the police in his 3rd letter, asking, "Have they found what is in the walls? In time they will." The family never spent a single night in their dream home.
They were forced to sell the house at a massive loss years later, terrorized into fleeing a town they loved. To this day, the Watcher has never been identified, and the new owners of 657 Boulevard must wonder. Every time they look out the window into the dark, is he still watching?
There is a profound emptiness to West Texas at midnight. The highways stretch on for hours in total, suffocating darkness, broken only by the occasional beam of headlights. If you find yourself stranded out there, you're entirely alone. On August 9th, 2013, 26-year-old Brandon Lawson left his home in San Angelo, Texas, after a heated argument with his common-law wife. He climbed into his pickup truck and drove north on Highway 277, heading toward his father's house. Just before midnight, his truck ran out of gas. Brandon called his brother Kyle, asking him to bring a gas, and Kyle agreed and immediately started driving toward Brandon's location. But a few minutes later, Brandon made another phone call. This time, he didn't call his brother. He dialed 911. The audio of this emergency call is heavily degraded, distorted by poor cell reception, and Brandon's panicked, breathless voice. It remains one of the most chilling and hotly debated recordings in true crime history. Yes, I'm in the middle of a field, Brandon told the dispatcher, his words rushing together in terror. A state cop just pulled some guys over, right here going towards Abilene, on both sides. The dispatcher struggled to understand him. You're where? How did that happen? My truck ran out of gas. Brandon stammered, breathing heavily into the receiver. There's one car here. The guy is chasing me to the woods. Please hurry. Are you running into the woods? The dispatcher asked. We're not talking to him, Brandon replied, his voice dropping to a frantic whisper. I told you I ran into them. I got the first guy. Then the dispatcher asked if he needed an ambulance. Brandon's final, desperate words before the audio cut out completely were, "No! I need the cops!" When Kyle arrived at the scene a short time later, he found Brandon's truck parked hazardously on the side of the highway. The doors were unlocked, the keys were gone. But there was no sign of Brandon, and no sign of anyone else. A local sheriff's deputy pulled up behind the abandoned truck at almost the exact same time. As Kyle and the deputy stood by the empty vehicle, Kyle's cell phone suddenly rang. It was Brandon. The cell connection was incredibly weak. Brandon's voice was barely a whisper cutting through the static. I'm in the field, Brandon gasped. I'm bleeding. Kyle told him to walk toward the flashing lights of the police cruiser on the highway. But Brandon didn't answer. The line simply went dead. A massive search of the surrounding brush was launched. Helicopters with thermal imaging swept the area. Dogs trekked his scent into the jagged mesquite trees before losing it entirely. Despite thousands of hours of searching, Brandon Lawson had vanished into the Texas dark. It wasn't until early 2022 that clothing matching what Brandon wore that night was finally discovered deep in the rugged wilderness, not far from where he disappeared. But the discovery offered no comfort. It only cemented the terrifying truth. Whatever
or whoever, chased Brandon Lawson into the dark that night, made sure he never made it back to the road.
Is supposed to be the ultimate sanctuary. When you put a child to bed and lock the front door, you assume the rest of the world is kept safely outside. But on the morning of February 14th, 2000, in the quiet town of Shelby, North Carolina, that sanctuary was broken from the inside out. At 2:30 in the morning, a father checked on his 9-year-old daughter, Asha Degree, and her older brother. Both were sound asleep in their beds. A fierce winter rainstorm was raging outside, plunging the neighborhood into freezing, pitch-black darkness. The father went to sleep, but sometime between 2:30 and 6:30 a.m., little Asha woke up. She quietly packed her book bag with a few favorite outfits, her family photograph, and her house keys. She put on her white sneakers, unlocked the front door, and walked out into the freezing, driving rainstorm. She didn't take a coat. When her mother went to wake her up for school at 6:30 a.m., Asha's bed was empty. Panic instantly set and the doors were checked. The police were called. How does a terrified, shy 9-year-old girl, a girl who was famously afraid of the dark and dogs, willingly walk out into a severe winter storm at 3 in the morning? The police quickly received 2 terrifying tips from motorists. Between 3:45 and 4:15 a.m., 2 separate truckers reported seeing a small child walking completely alone down the shoulder of Highway 18 miles from her home. One of the drivers was so alarmed that he turned his massive 18-wheeler around and slowly drove back to check on her. But as he approached, the little girl panicked. She abandoned the side of the highway and ran off into the pitch-black, freezing woods. That was the last time Asha Degree was ever seen alive. Days later, search dogs led investigators to a small, abandoned tool shed deep in the woods near where she ran off the road inside. They found a few of Asha's belongings, a pencil, a marker, and a Mickey Mouse hairbow. She had sought shelter there from the storm, but where did she go next? The most chilling clue didn't surface until a 1.5 years later. A construction worker was digging an access road nearly 26 miles away from Shelby. His excavator unearthed something buried deep in the dirt. It was Asha's book bag. The bag hadn't just been thrown away. It had been meticulously double-wrapped in heavy black plastic trash bags to protect it from the elements. Then intentionally buried, the police analyzed the contents, but the results were kept strictly classified. Did someone lure Asha out of her house that night? Was she sleepwalking? Or was she trying to meet someone she trusted? Over 2 decades later, the freezing rain still holds the answers, and her parents still keep their front door unlocked, praying that one day she will walk back through it. The ocean is the ultimate eraser. It swallows ships, aircraft, and people, leaving absolutely no trace behind. But occasionally, the water spits something back out. And when it does, The truth is often more terrifying than the disappearance. In February of 1979, 5 friends set out from Maui, Hawaii, in a small 17-foot motorboat named the Sarah Joe. It was supposed to be a routine afternoon of fishing. But within hours, the sky turned black. A freak, violent storm slammed into the coast. The winds reached hurricane force. The waves swelled to 30 feet. When the storm finally broke the next morning, the Sarah Joe was gone. The Coast Guard launched a massive search covering tens of thousands of square miles. They found no wreckage, no life jackets, no bodies. The 5 men were officially declared lost at sea. For 10 years, the families mourned. The case was closed. Then, in 1988, a marine biologist was on an expedition to the Marshall Islands. He was exploring Taongi Atoll, a completely uninhabited barren ring of coral over 2,200 miles away from Hawaii. Walking along the desolate, sun-bleached beach, the biologist stumbled upon a deteriorated fiberglass boat. He brushed the sand off the hull and read the faded registration numbers. It was the Sarah Joe. Finding a tiny boat that had drifted over 2,000 miles across the Pacific was a statistical miracle. But it was what he found just a few yards away that turned the discovery into a nightmare. Hidden in the brush, just off the beach, was a shallow, freshly dug human grave. A crude cross made of driftwood was stuck in the sand. Protruding from the top of the grave was a human jawbone. Dental records confirmed the remains belonged to Scott Moorman, one of the 5 young men from the Sarah Joe. But the discovery made absolutely no sense. The grave was meticulously constructed. Whoever buried Scott had placed a stack of blank, square pieces of paper between the layers of rocks covering his body. A bizarre ritual that matched no known island culture. Even more chilling, the Marshallese government had conducted an exhaustive, official survey of this exact island just 4 years earlier. They had walked this precise beach. The boat wasn't there. The grave wasn't there. This meant that for years after the storm, the Sarah Joe was drifting somewhere out in the vast, empty Pacific. Did Scott Moorman survive the storm, drift for years, and bury himself? Impossible. Who was on that boat with him when it finally washed ashore? Who dug the grave? Who placed the blank papers? And where did the other 4 men go? To this day, the ocean refuses to answer. The ocean does not just take people sometimes. It takes entire cities made of steel. In March of 1918, during the height of World War I, the USS Cyclops, a massive Navy collier ship, was steaming toward Baltimore from Brazil. She was over 500 feet long, carried over 10,000 tons of manganese ore, and was manned by 306 sailors and passengers. She was a behemoth. A ship of that size, equipped with the latest wireless radio technology, was considered nearly unsinkable by anything other than a direct torpedo hit. The weather was fair. The seas were calm. The last message sent by the captain was routine. Weather fair, all well. But the Cyclops never arrived. She sailed into a stretch of water known as the Bermuda Triangle and simply vanished from the face of the earth. No distress signal was ever sent, no SOS, no frantic radio calls, just absolute, sudden silence. The Navy launched one of the most massive searches in maritime history. Every square mile of the route was scoured by hundreds of ships and aircraft. They weren't just looking for survivors, they were looking for an oil slick, a floating life ring, or a single piece of wood. They found nothing. There was no record of any German U-boat activity in the area. There were no mines reported, and the weather stations confirmed that no major storms occurred on her path. For over a century, theories have swirled. Did the ship's heavy cargo shift suddenly, causing her to capsize in seconds? Did the structural steel fail, snapping the ship in half? Or did she encounter something in the depths that modern science still cannot explain? Even today, with our advanced sonar and deep-sea submersibles, not a single bolt, rivet, or scrap of steel from the USS Cyclops has ever been found. 306 souls and a 500-foot ship are still lying somewhere in the pitch-black silence of the Atlantic. And until she is found, she remains the largest non-combat loss of life in U.S. Navy history. Christmas Eve is supposed to be the night where every child is safely accounted for. But for the Sutter family in 1945, the holiday turned into a waking nightmare that has never ended. In the middle of the night, a fire broke out in the Sutter home in Fayetteville. West Virginia George and Jenny Sutter escaped with 4 of their children. But 5 others, Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty, were trapped upstairs. George tried to save them. He tried to climb his ladder, but it was missing from its usual spot. He tried to drive his trucks to the side of the house to climb up, but both trucks, which had worked perfectly that morning, refused to start. The phone lines had been cut. By the time the fire died down, the house was a pile of ash. But when the fire marshals sifted through the debris, the mystery began. They found no bones, no remains, no skeletons. The fire was hot, but not hot enough to completely incinerate 5 human bodies in under an hour. It was as if the children had vanished before the first flame even started. Years later, the family received a letter in the mail. Inside was a photograph of a young man who looked exactly like their missing son, Louis, as an adult. On the back, a cryptic message was scrawled: Louis Sutter, I love brother Frankie, little boys. George and Jenny spent the rest of their lives and every penny they had on private investigators and a massive billboard on the highway pleading for information. They died without ever knowing the truth. Were the children kidnapped by the strangers seen watching the house days earlier? Or are they still out there, somewhere, living lives they don't remember? The archive is now closed. Tonight, we have walked through the shadows of the unexplained and the forgotten. But now, it is time to let the mysteries rest. The rain is falling. The world is quiet. And the vault is locked. Thank you for spending your night with us. If you find comfort in the dark, subscribe and join us for the next volume. But for now, close your eyes. Let the sound of the rain pull you under. Sleep well.